What started as a routine courtroom hearing turned into a national scandal, when Karoline Leavitt stood up, looked the judge in the eye, and dropped a single sentence that left the entire courtroom stunned. In just 4 minutes, one of the state's most powerful judges went from untouchable to unraveling. You won't believe what she revealed, or how fast it all came crashing down. Karoline Leavitt, known across political circles for her bold presence, piercing gaze, and no-nonsense approach, arrived at the courtroom that morning with her head held high and her heart prepared for battle. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, she exuded calm determination. Her supporters outside the courthouse had cheered her on as she walked through the doors, but inside, she knew she was alone. This wasn't just about her, it was about something far bigger. She believed the system was broken, tainted by power and corruption, and today she intended to expose it, no matter the cost. The courtroom was tense. Cameras rolled in the back, their red lights blinking like silent watchers. Journalists scribbled notes, sensing this wasn't going to be a routine hearing. On the bench sat Judge Harold Bexley, an imposing figure with silver hair, cold eyes, and decades of control behind the gavel. His reputation preceded him. A man who ruled with an iron fist and whose decisions rarely, if ever, were questioned. Lawyers and defendants alike whispered of his connections, untraceable deals, favored corporations, buried scandals, but no one had dared say anything publicly. Fear and influence were powerful tools, and Judge Bexley had mastered them. Karoline knew this. But she also knew something else, something that gave her the strength to step into the lion's den. She had uncovered information, evidence that tied Judge Bexley directly to a tangled web of corruption. She didn't have to say much today, just enough to shake the walls and let the truth begin to echo. The moment she stood to speak, the tension in the courtroom thickened. All eyes were on her. Her legal counsel gave her a quick nod, silently encouraging her to proceed. She took a breath, ready to make her opening statement. But just as she opened her mouth, Judge Bexley slammed his gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber. "Miss Leavitt," he said, voice heavy with authority, "this is my courtroom. You'll speak when I allow it." His tone wasn't just firm, it was condescending, designed to embarrass and silence her before she could even begin. The murmurs in the courtroom grew quieter. Some were shocked, others simply used to this type of performance from Bexley. But Karoline stood her ground. Her expression didn't flinch, her hands didn't tremble. She held his gaze with quiet defiance, not blinking. She tried once more, respectfully requesting to proceed with her prepared statement. And again, without hesitation, Bexley interrupted her. This time louder, angrier. "I will not tolerate disrespect in this courtroom," he bellowed, pounding his gavel again. "You are held in contempt of court." Gasps rippled through the room. A few people audibly reacted, startled by the escalation. Karoline had barely said a full sentence. The charge of contempt was not only unjustified, it was outrageous. The bailiffs shifted in their stance, unsure of whether to move forward and detain her or wait for clearer instructions. Karoline turned slightly, looking toward the public gallery. Her family sat there, stunned. Her supporters, those few who managed to enter, looked confused and alarmed. But Karoline didn't back down. Her voice, calm and even, cut through the silence like a knife. "Then I suppose it's time someone mentioned Apex Corp," she said, eyes locked on Bexley. In that instant, everything changed. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop. Judge Bexley's face, once red with power, turned pale. For a second, he appeared frozen, as if trying to process what she had just said. It was a name he wasn't expecting to hear, not here, not now, and definitely not from her. Apex Corp wasn't just any company. It was one of the largest corporate entities in the region, with deep political ties and a long history of controversy. Rumors had circulated for years that the corporation had helped Bexley secure investments, land deals, even his second home. Nothing had ever been proven, until now. And just by saying the name, Karoline had pulled back the curtain. The room was no longer quiet. Reporters began whispering urgently into their phones. One or two cameras zoomed in closer on Karoline's face. Everyone could sense it, this wasn't just courtroom drama anymore. This was the beginning of something far bigger. Judge Bexley stammered, his voice shaking slightly as he ordered her words struck from the record. He pounded his gavel again, but this time the sound seemed hollow, desperate. He was no longer in control. The courtroom no longer feared him, they were watching him. Karoline stood tall. She had said only one sentence, but it was enough. Enough to challenge a giant. Enough to break the silence that had kept the truth buried for years. And in that moment, with all eyes upon her and the once invincible judge visibly shaken, she knew, the foundation of his empire had just cracked. And it was only the beginning. Those next 4 minutes. They would be remembered forever, not just by those inside the courtroom, but by millions who would soon watch it unfold from their phones, their computers, and their television screens. What began as an ordinary legal proceeding turned into a moment that would shake the foundations of power in the state. Karoline Leavitt didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout or point fingers. She simply looked Judge Harold Bexley in the eye, calm as ever, and delivered a single sentence that would light the fuse. Then I guess it's time someone spoke about your deals with Apex Corporation. Time seemed to stop. For a moment, it felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Every lawyer, journalist, bailiff, and observer froze, processing what had just been said. The silence was heavy, charged with tension, disbelief, and the dawning realization that the powerful judge may not be as untouchable as everyone thought. Judge Bexley's face, once flushed with anger and authority, turned ghostly pale. His jaw clenched, and his hand instinctively reached for the gavel, not to restore order, but to ground himself. The name Apex Corp was one that many had whispered about in political corners and legal circles. It was a name connected to questionable contracts, public-private partnerships that never added up, and legal decisions that always seemed to tilt in their favor. But despite all the suspicions, no one had ever dared to speak it in a courtroom, certainly not in front of Judge Bexley. But Karoline had said it. Out loud. On record. And in front of cameras. The irony was almost poetic. Courtroom cameras had been set up to document a separate civil case scheduled later that afternoon. They weren't even supposed to be active for Karoline's hearing. But due to an earlier delay and an eager media presence, the recording was rolling, and they had caught every second of her statement in crystal clarity. In the back of the room, reporters who had previously been half-engaged suddenly leapt to life. Fingers flew across phone screens as tweets were typed and sent. Some journalists called their editors, whispering frantically into their phones. Karoline's words had triggered something no one could ignore. The murmurs among spectators grew louder, blending into audible gasps and hushed exclamations. Something massive had just happened, and everyone knew it. Judge Bexley, in a panicked attempt to contain the situation, slammed his gavel once again. This is irrelevant. Strike that from the record, he barked. His voice, once confident and commanding, now cracked with uncertainty. He looked to the stenographer, to the bailiffs, to his clerk, anyone, searching for backup, for a way to erase what had just occurred. But it was too late. The damage had already been done, and no courtroom order could undo it. The footage was already in the hands of media outlets. Live streams had picked it up. Social media users who had been following Karoline's case quickly clipped and shared the moment. Within just 4 minutes of her statement, the video was exploding across platforms. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, it was everywhere. On Twitter, the hashtag Karoline exposes Bexley began trending within minutes. Influential users, journalists, and even politicians began weighing in. TikTok creators stitched the clip into their videos, breaking down the moment and what it could mean for the state's justice system. On YouTube, live streams were already dissecting the courtroom confrontation in real time. The speed at which the story spread was dizzying. And while the public was reacting, something more dangerous was happening behind the scenes. Investigative reporters who had long held files on Apex Corp's shady dealings began connecting the dots. Public records were being pulled, campaign donations reviewed, and court decisions cross-referenced. It was like the first domino had tipped, and now an entire structure was beginning to fall. Meanwhile, Judge Bexley sat at his bench, clearly rattled. His usual commanding posture had faded. He looked smaller, suddenly aware that the power he had wielded for so long was slipping through his fingers in real time. Every movement was now under a microscope. Every past decision, every deal, every judgment was about to be questioned. Karoline stood her ground, unmoved by the judge's outburst or the chaos that followed. She had spoken her truth, and the truth had found an audience. What she had planned for weeks, maybe even months, was now unfolding exactly as she had hoped. She didn't need to say anything else. The avalanche had already begun. 4 minutes. That's all it took. 4 minutes to shift the spotlight, to crack the facade, and to begin exposing one of the most carefully concealed alliances of corruption the state had ever seen. 4 minutes that would go down in history. Within hours of the courtroom confrontation, the internet erupted with intensity that no one could have predicted. What started as a single sentence from Karoline Leavitt became the match that lit a wildfire. Social media was ablaze with conversation, speculation, and investigation. Hashtags like #JudgeExposed, #Karoline vs Corruption, and #BexleyLeaks rocketed to the top of trending charts. Millions of users flooded Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, and Reddit, not just to react, but to dig deeper. People wanted answers, and this time, the public wasn't going to wait for mainstream media to do the heavy lifting. TikTok sleuths began sifting through publicly available documents. Activists and amateur investigators downloaded years of court decisions. Reddit users created sprawling threads that connected dots most people had never even thought to look at. Twitter threads began to circulate with screenshots, links to land deals, PAC contributions, and archived versions of government pages that were quietly scrubbed months ago. What they found shocked even the most cynical observers. Judge Harold Bexley, once seen as a symbol of firm but fair justice, had approved ruling after ruling that directly benefited Apex Corporation. Over the last decade, his courtroom had become a clearinghouse for cases that suspiciously ended in Apex's favor. Legal challenges to the corporation's environmental violations had been thrown out. Whistleblower cases from former employees had been dismissed on technicalities. Bexley had cited insufficient evidence more times than seemed reasonable, and always in cases involving Apex or its subsidiaries. But it didn't stop there. A new layer of scandal emerged when a Twitter user found that Bexley's name was tied to a luxury vacation property in Colorado. It was registered under a shell corporation, but the LLC was connected to a real estate firm that had received investment from none other than Apex Corporation. A financial trail began to take shape. Investigators traced property tax records and company filings and uncovered that Apex had indirectly funded the purchase of that vacation home, what Bexley had once called his peaceful getaway. The internet wasn't done. A TikTok creator with a background in corporate law exposed a hidden partnership between Bexley and a private law firm that quietly handled several of Apex's settlements. On paper, Bexley had divested years ago. But the firm's growth coincided almost perfectly with Apex's increasing court victories. A closer look revealed that Bexley still received consulting payments from a separate trust linked to the firm's founding partner, his college roommate. The digital trail was messy, but persistent users connected the dots, and suddenly, Bexley's impartiality was in serious question. Then came the land deal. A recent court ruling had greenlit a controversial land transfer involving public property. Local communities had protested it for months, claiming it would hurt small businesses and displace families. Bexley had approved it anyway, stating that the transaction was legally sound. As online users combed through planning commission minutes and developer contracts, they found something chilling. Apex Corp had bought the land under a different name, one of its many shell companies. And the first phase of development? A massive distribution hub, poised to increase profits and dominate the local economy. Every revelation poured gasoline on an already burning fire. Mainstream media had no choice but to follow the story. Overnight, major news outlets began citing the findings from social media, and investigative journalists jumped in to verify and expand on what citizen sleuths had uncovered. Within 24 hours, Judge Bexley's name was splashed across every major news channel in the country. Public pressure mounted. Protesters began gathering outside the courthouse with signs that read, "Justice for sale," and "Remove the robe." Petitions for Bexley's resignation gained tens of thousands of signatures in hours. And at the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt. She hadn't planned to become a national symbol. She had simply spoken up when no one else would. But now, people were calling her a modern-day whistleblower, a truth-teller, a fighter for justice. Young people praised her courage. Veterans of political activism called her a turning point. Journalists requested interviews, politicians tweeted in her support, and advocacy groups asked her to speak at rallies. Karoline became more than just a person involved in a legal dispute, she became a movement. A symbol of defiance in the face of corruption. A reminder that sometimes, all it takes is one voice, one bold statement, to spark a reckoning. While Bexley's empire began to fall apart piece by piece, Karoline's name soared into the national conversation, not just as a hero of the moment, but as a catalyst for something bigger: accountability, justice, and the end of a long, silent era of fear. As the scandal swept through news cycles and social media feeds like a hurricane, the consequences came faster than anyone had expected. What had started with a single sentence in a courtroom now rippled through every level of power connected to Judge Harold Bexley and Apex Corporation. The state attorney general, under massive public pressure, held a press conference less than 24 hours after Karoline Leavitt's courtroom bombshell. With cameras flashing and microphones crowding the podium, the AG announced an official investigation into Judge Bexley, citing credible evidence suggesting serious breaches of judicial ethics and potential criminal misconduct. Almost simultaneously, Apex Corp's glossy headquarters became the site of a major law enforcement action. Unmarked SUVs pulled into the parking lot. Federal and state investigators entered the building with warrants in hand. Employees watched in stunned silence as boxes of documents, hard drives, and office equipment were carried out. The company's public relations team quickly released a generic statement denying wrongdoing, but the damage was already done. Stocks plummeted. Shareholders panicked. Board members began resigning quietly in the background. As the news broke, Judge Bexley was placed on administrative leave. Once feared and respected, he now faced suspension from the very system he had ruled over for years. Media outlets swarmed his residence. The man who once commanded silence with a single gavel strike was suddenly mute in the face of growing accusations. Former allies distanced themselves. Judges and attorneys who had once praised his firmness now called for accountability and transparency. Then came the floodgates. In the days that followed, more whistleblowers came forward. A former court clerk, shaking but resolute, appeared on live television and described how she was once instructed to misplace case files that painted Apex in a negative light. A defense attorney recounted being warned not to push too hard in a case against the corporation, hinting at career-ending consequences. Even a few former defendants shared their stories, men and women who claimed their cases were dismissed unfairly or judgments turned suspiciously against them when Apex was even remotely involved. Each new voice added weight to the growing narrative. Judge Bexley hadn't just bent the rules, he had shattered them, repeatedly, to serve corporate interests. As the layers of deceit peeled away, it became clear that this was more than just a scandal. It was a complete collapse of a legal empire built on fear, favoritism, and fraud. Bexley, once seen as a fixture of judicial authority, now faced federal scrutiny. Legal analysts predicted multiple charges ranging from obstruction of justice to conspiracy to commit fraud. The public, meanwhile, was furious. Protests formed outside courthouses across the state. People held signs that read, "Justice for sale," and "Corruption ends now." The chant that echoed the loudest, however, was simple and powerful: Karoline was right. But while the spotlight blazed on Bexley and Apex, Karoline Leavitt wasn't finished. She stepped in front of the microphones once again, this time not as a defendant or a whistleblower, but as a voice for those who had long gone unheard. Standing on the courthouse steps, with reporters, supporters, and everyday citizens crowded around her, she delivered a speech that struck at the heart of the moment. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice steady and passionate. "It's about every voice that's been silenced, every family ruined by greed, and every honest citizen who thought the system would protect them. We're taking it back." Cheers erupted from the crowd. Some clapped. Others wiped away tears. For many, it wasn't just her words, it was the courage behind them. Karoline had done what no one else dared to do. She had spoken up in the face of power, not with rage or fear, but with clarity, purpose, and undeniable truth. In the days that followed, her press conference was replayed across every major network. Editorials praised her bravery. Civic groups invited her to speak. Students wrote essays about her. She wasn't just a local political figure anymore, she had become a symbol, a reminder that even the most powerful can be held accountable, and that sometimes all it takes is one voice to shatter decades of silence. As investigations continued and the legal system prepared for what many called the trial of the decade, one thing was certain: the era of Judge Bexley was over. And Karoline Leavitt had changed the course of history with just one sentence. "This case is far from over. In fact, some say it's only just beginning." Judge Harold Bexley, once considered a towering figure in the state's legal system, now sits in disgrace, his legacy crumbling under the weight of mounting evidence and public outrage. His courtroom, once ruled with intimidation and unchecked authority, has become the focal point of a statewide reckoning. Apex Corp., the powerful company at the heart of the scandal, is facing serious legal fire. Raids, subpoenas, and investigations continue to uncover more damning connections, more unethical deals, and more lives affected by their unchecked influence. But beyond the headlines, beyond the legal jargon and political fallout, lies the true core of this story: the extraordinary power of speaking out. In just 4 minutes, less time than most people spend scrolling through social media, one woman, standing alone in a courtroom, dared to confront corruption that had gone unchallenged for years. Karoline Leavitt, armed only with the truth and a refusal to be intimidated, ignited a chain reaction that exposed deep-rooted rot in the very system meant to deliver justice. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She simply said what needed to be said, and the world listened. Karoline hadn't stepped into that courtroom expecting to become a symbol. She wasn't aiming for the spotlight. She was there because she believed something was wrong, and she was unwilling to stay silent. In a place where silence had become the norm, where victims were dismissed, and power went unchecked, she broke that silence in a single, measured sentence. That sentence echoed far beyond the walls of that courtroom. It spread across social media, news broadcasts, dinner tables, and legislative offices. It reminded everyone watching that truth still holds power, even in places where it has long been suppressed. The impact of that moment is still unfolding. Whistleblowers continue to come forward, empowered by Karoline's bravery. Judges and lawyers once too afraid to speak now share their concerns. Political leaders are being forced to answer hard questions about oversight and accountability. Citizens, energized and emboldened, are calling for reform, transparency, and real justice. The ripple effects of that one statement are growing into a wave of change that can no longer be ignored. And yet, the most powerful part of this story isn't just the fall of a judge or the investigation of a corporation. It's the realization that courage is contagious. Karoline Leavitt showed the world that one voice, even when alone, can pierce through the noise, the corruption, and the fear. She reminded people that silence isn't safety, it's complicity. And by choosing to speak, she gave others permission to do the same. The people were watching. They were listening. And now, they are ready to act. Across the state and beyond, everyday citizens are demanding answers. They're organizing, voting, and raising their own voices. Civic engagement has surged. Grassroots movements have found new life. In schools and workplaces, conversations about ethics, justice, and accountability are happening with a newfound urgency. It's not just about Judge Bexley or Apex Corp anymore, it's about reclaiming a system that had strayed too far from the people it was meant to serve. Karoline's moment in the courtroom has become more than just a viral clip, it's become a turning point. A symbol of what happens when someone refuses to be silenced. A blueprint for how to stand firm in the face of power. And a rallying cry for anyone who's ever been told to sit down, shut up, or look the other way. This story is a reminder, even the most powerful can fall. No matter how protected, how connected, or how feared they may be, they are not immune to accountability. But it takes someone willing to take the first step. Someone willing to speak when it's easier to stay silent. Someone who believes that truth still matters. All it takes is one voice to start the avalanche. Karoline Leavitt was that voice. And thanks to her, a broken system is being forced to answer for its actions. The road ahead will be long, and the fight is far from over. But the momentum has shifted. The people are awake. And the walls that once protected corruption are beginning to collapse. In the end, that's what true change looks like, not just a courtroom shakeup, but a collective awakening. And it all started with 4 unforgettable minutes. If Karoline's courage inspired you, hit that like button. Want more jaw-dropping stories like this? Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. And tell us in the comments, do you think justice will truly be served? Let's talk about it below. Backhand index pointing down.